my man what it is.
He wanted to drop off the team.
Here we go. Check it out. All sides. No way.
At a high school basketball game, a boy named Scott adds to his team's bad day by missing a free throw. The opponents, led by their star player, Mick, happen to be very good players, and they score more points to increase their lead. Scott and his teammates aren't really good enough, and they easily get bullied and knocked to the ground. Their coach, Finstock, eventually feels sorry for them and calls a timeout so they can rest. Scott looks exhausted, but he still tries to catch a glimpse of his crush, Pamela, who doesn't even know that he exists. As he walks toward the bench, Finstock commends him and the other players for their efforts so far. Finstock then meets with the other coach and suggests forfeiting the match because the lead is already too big. The other coach doesn't like this because his players have league scoring records at stake. He says it wouldn't be fair to them to quit because Finstock's team isn't good enough. Finstock says he's only looking out for the other team because if his team quits now, their opponents will be able to leave early and beat the traffic on their way back home. The other coach insists that he wants the game to continue, and he adds that there's a lot to learn from losing. Finstock eventually gives up trying to convince the other coach, and he heads over to meet his players. After the game continues, Mick's team scores more points to increase their big lead. The vice principal of Scott's school, Thorne, soon gets to the court and laments that things aren't going well for the team.
Burn the house.
Finstock says there wasn't much to expect anyway, and that the other team have much better sneakers than his players. Almost immediately, one of Scott's teammates, Chubby, gets a shooting chance but throws the ball toward Finstock. Thorne looks shocked by this, but Finstock says that Chubby has a great arm. With only a few seconds left in the game, Scott gets the ball, but Mick tries to snatch it from him. Scott refuses to give it up easily, but Mick doesn't understand this because Scott's team are already losing by a huge margin. As Scott gets pissed that Mick still won't leave the ball, he suddenly growls in a strange way. Mick looks scared and immediately leaves the ball. Scott then tries to score one last point for his team before the game ends. As he shoots the ball, everyone watches it closely, but it eventually lands on the rim and bounces off.
Pronto, let me go.
Well, Mr.
Scott looks disappointed, and as the game ends, he and his teammates head to the locker room. Finstock tries to cheer up the boys by saying they didn't really play badly. He adds that there are still a lot of games left to play in the season, and they can surely turn things around. Most of the players don't believe this, and one of them scolds the others for not playing well. As Scott heads to his locker, he sees some junk food inside Chubby's locker and complains about this because everyone expects Chubby to be on a diet. Chubby doesn't seem to care about this, and Scott just leaves him alone. Almost immediately, Scott's best friend, Styles, enters the locker room to cheer up the players and praise them for playing well. One of the players asks if he knows that they lost, but Styles says the referee needed glasses. He then heads towards Scott and asks if he can borrow some money to buy a beer keg that will gain him access to a party happening tonight. Scott says he doesn't have any cash, and he wonders how Styles plans to buy the drink, even though he's not 18 yet. Styles says he'll figure it out, and after he walks away, Scott suddenly sees a strange, long hair on his chest. As he removes it, he looks confused and wonders if something strange is happening to him. Shortly after, Scott packs his things and heads to Finstock's office. Finstock looks happy to see Scott, and he asks if there's no problem. Scott then reminds Finstock about how he used to tell the players that they could come talk to him if something was bothering them. Finstock confirms this and asks if Scott is having issues with schoolwork or girls. Scott says it's a bit more complicated and that he believes he's going through some changes.
What do you think?
Finstock thinks he's talking about puberty, but Scott says he can't really explain it. He adds that he's not sure he'll still be able to play basketball. Finstock doesn't think Scott is going through anything that might make him consider quitting, unlike some other students. He gives an example of someone who quit the team a while ago, so he could get a job to help his family. Finstock says it's not the same for Scott because he has a job with his dad. He adds that Scott is a starter on the basketball team, and he can't just abandon them. Scott looks disappointed that Finstock doesn't understand him, but he still thanks the coach for the advice. After this, he meets up with his childhood friend, Boof, who has been waiting for him so they can walk home together. On the way, Scott complains about how the team played, and Boof says they were really bad. Scott then says he's just tired of being average, not just at basketball, but with every other thing in his life. He says he really wants his life to change because he doesn't want to end up working at his dad's hardware shop for the rest of his life. Boof believes Scott's dad is a great guy, but Scott doesn't say much about this. He then tells Boof to look at him objectively to see if there's something wrong with him. Boof says he looks great, but Scott doesn't believe this because Pamela still ignores him. Boof says Scott can do much better than Pamela, but he doesn't think so. Suddenly, Boof seems pissed and changes the topic. Scott asks if he said something wrong, but she says he didn't. When they get to Scott's dad's shop, Boof says she'll see him at the party later tonight. Scott doesn't get why she seems pissed, but it turns out that Boof likes him, but he doesn't feel the same way. Meanwhile, Scott enters his dad's shop and greets his dad, Harold, who asks how the game went. Scott complains that they lost, and Harold tells him not to think much about it because the school hasn't won a game in 3 years. Suddenly, a boy at the shop starts blowing a dog whistle that makes Scott uncomfortable. Surprisingly, Scott is the only one who feels this way, and he finds the boy and collects the whistle from him. The boy says the whistle is broken, and as Scott looks at it, he wonders why a dog whistle made such a loud sound and made him uncomfortable.
Sweat, you can't go in.
Shortly after, Scott heads to school to deliver some supplies meant for the drama teacher, Kirk. On the way, a tape falls from his hand and Thorne sees it. Interestingly, Thorne doesn't like Scott, and he throws the tape back aggressively. Scott is forced to drop all the other items in his hand, but he still thanks Thorne. After this, Scott heads to the school hall, where Pamela is rehearsing for a part in the school play while Kirk watches her. When Scott gets there, he drops an item that makes a loud noise and disturbs Kirk and Pamela. Kirk seems pissed, but when he realizes that Scott came to deliver his supplies, he heads over to collect them. Almost immediately, Scott notices that his hands are hairy, and he quickly hides them so that Kirk and Pamela won't see them. After Kirk grabs all the things he ordered, Scott asks if Pamela is going to the party tonight because he wouldn't mind
by Thomas Wolfe.
driving her there. Mick walks in right on time, and Pamela tells Scott that she already has a ride. Mick then jokes about the way Scott played earlier. He also asks if Scott is an actor, but Pamela says he's just a delivery boy. Pamela and Mick joke about this, and Scott looks disappointed. After they leave, Scott looks at his hands and sees that the hair has disappeared. Elsewhere, Styles goes to a liquor store and tries to bribe the store owner so he can get what he wants. However, the store owner just takes his money and sends him out because he's still underage. When Styles returns to his car to meet his friend, Lewis, he seems pissed that his plan didn't work. Lewis says they can just forget about it, but Styles says he's not giving up. Meanwhile,
You are correct.
Scott arrives home and sits with his dad to have dinner. Scott then tells Harold that he's considering quitting the basketball team. Harold looks confused and says that Scott isn't even the worst player on the team. Scott says it's not about that, and he just wants to try something else, like joining the school play. Harold says it's not a bad idea, and he tells Scott not to forget that his late mom used to say there's nothing he can't do. Scott thanks his dad for the encouragement and asks if Harold has ever felt like something strange is happening to him. As Harold says it's time for them to talk about something, Styles walks in and interrupts them. He also tells Scott that it's time for them to go to the party. After this, they leave the house and Scott drives his van behind Styles' car. Styles then stops at the liquor store and gives Scott a toy gun, which he can use to scare the store owner to get what he wants. Scott doesn't think they have to use a gun, but Styles says they won't be robbing the store because they'd still pay for the drink. He adds that he could have followed Scott inside, but the store owner already knows him. Despite this, Scott throws the gun away and says that he believes the man will sell the drink to him.
Form did this particular another miracle tape.
When Scott enters the store owner looks at him and realizes that he's underage. Scott says he wants a beer keg, but the store owner responds that he needs to see an ID before he sells it. Suddenly, Scott's voice grows thicker, and the store owner also sees a red glow in his eyes. As the man looks scared, he immediately gives Scott the beer keg. Stiles looks excited when he sees the beer keg, and he sings happily while driving to the party. Meanwhile, Lewis is now inside Scott's van, and he asks how Scott was able to get the store owner to give him the beer keg. Scott says he just asked, and Lewis seems amazed. Scott then changes the topic and says he's excited about the party because Pamela will be there. Lewis says Mick will also be there.
Well, I don't see anything. Come on.
But Scott believes he won't. Lewis then talks about Mick being older than they are. He adds that the only reason Mick is still in high school is because he went to jail. Scott still mentions that he likes Pamela, but Lewis doesn't understand why he won't just go for Boof, who likes him. Before Scott can say much, Stiles tells him to stop the van. After this, Stiles tells Lewis to drive his car because he wants to do something. Lewis doesn't understand this, but he eventually heads into Stiles' car to drive it. As Scott then drives the van, Stiles climbs onto the roof and starts dancing. Scott enjoys this, but as he looks in the mirror, he notices that his ears are now strange. He looks shocked and nearly loses control of the van, but after realizing that Stiles is still on the roof, he stays calm. His ears also change back, and shortly after, they arrive at the party. After they enter the house, Scott sees Pamela standing alone
And these.
and jokingly asks if he's the one she's waiting for. Pamela seems disgusted and says it's not him. As she walks away, Scott looks disappointed, but Boof jokes that Pamela has now talked to him. Shortly after, everyone plays a game at the party in which they get paired with a partner. Boof gets paired with someone else, but she decides to go with Scott instead. Stiles then jokingly locks them in a closet, and Scott finds it weird that he got Boof. Unfortunately, Scott starts acting strange, and by the time the door gets unlocked, Boof looks terrified. It also turns out that Scott clawed her back and tore her shirt, but no one notices this. As Scott continues feeling strange, he heads home and goes straight to the bathroom. Harold seems confused and asks what's wrong, but Scott doesn't say anything. He tries to calm himself by pouring water on his face, but this doesn't work, and Scott suddenly turns into a werewolf.
No. Thanks a lot, Ernest.
As Scott looks shocked, Harold knocks on the door and tells him to open it. Scott says he's busy, but Harold insists that he has to open the door. Scott doesn't want to do this, but Harold says he'll understand whatever is going on, regardless of how strange it might seem. Scott then opens the door and sees that Harold is also a werewolf. Harold says an explanation is long overdue, but Scott cannot believe that his dad really hid something like that away from him. Harold says he was hoping he wouldn't have to tell Scott anything because the werewolf gene sometimes skips a generation. Scott still looks furious, and he just heads to his room because he doesn't know what else to do. Harold says they need to talk, but Scott tells him to go away. The next morning, Scott seems calmer, and Harold decides to talk to him about being a werewolf. Harold says it's not so bad, and that he and Scott's late mom learned to live with it. Scott says he doesn't want to live a life of stealing babies, killing chickens, fearing full moons, and dodging silver bullets. Harold says most of those things are portrayed wrongly in movies, and that Scott shouldn't believe them. He adds that with only a few exceptions,
Sport.
werewolves are people just like anyone else. He also mentions that the werewolf is only a part of Scott, and it doesn't change who he is. Scott then complains that he already has enough problems, and he doesn't need one more. Shortly after, he arrives at school, and as Pamela sees him, she says that there's something different about him. Scott seems surprised that she's talking to him, and he says he's just normal. Pamela insists that he's different, but she eventually says she has to meet up with Kirk. Boof sees Pamela talking to Scott, and she looks jealous. Later that day in class, Scott feels very uncomfortable and struggles to pay attention to his teacher. He soon gets called out to solve a question on the board. While Scott is standing in front of the board, his claws start coming out, and he quickly runs to the bathroom. As he tries to calm himself so that he won't change fully into a werewolf,
Drop basketball and get a job.
Thorne enters the bathroom and asks what's going on. Scott says he's fine, and Thorne asks to see his hands. Scott looks scared, but eventually shows Thorne, and the vice principal asks if he's with a marker because someone has been painting the bathroom mirrors. Scott then realizes that his claws have disappeared, and he tells Thorne that he's not the one. After school, Scott follows Stiles to his house. When they get there, Stiles opens the garage and tries to find his big brother's secret stash. Scott says there's something he wants to tell Stiles, and he asks what it is. Scott says he's a werewolf, and as Stiles turns back, he sees that his friend now looks different. Stiles asks if Scott can just change anytime he wants, but he says it's only sometimes. Even though Stiles looks scared at first,
You guys suck.
he says that Scott is beautiful. He adds that Scott will be happy with the decision to tell him because he'll find a way to turn Scott's new identity as a teen wolf into something interesting. Scott looks excited about this because Stiles doesn't have a problem with him being a werewolf. Shortly after, Scott arrives home and sees Harold playing basketball with Boof. Scott looks surprised, but Boof says they were just chatting. As she adds that she's ready to leave, Scott decides to walk her home. On the way, he asks what Boof was talking about with his dad. Boof says Harold only told her that Scott is considering quitting the basketball team to join the drama club. Scott confirms this, and Boof says she understands why he wants to join the drama club. However, she mentions that Pamela has a scary boyfriend, and he has to stay away from her. Scott says he's not sure if it will matter anymore, because he might soon have to stay away from everyone. Boof asks if he'll stay away from her, but Scott jokingly says he can't do that even if he tried. Just then, they both laugh about a time when they both
So where's the wolf?
tried to run away from home as kids. After this, Boof tells Scott that if there's anything bothering him, he can always talk to her. Boof says she'll understand, but Scott doesn't think she will. The next day, the basketball team comes up against another school. During the game, Scott gets 2 free throws. He then misses the first one, but before taking the next shot, a strange red glow appears in his eyes, and he scores the second one. Scott's friends look happy for him, and as the game continues, he grabs the ball again. However, as he falls, the other team's players try to snatch the ball from him. Scott then growls, and this scares everyone. As he stands up, it turns out that he has fully transformed into a werewolf.
Wow. Bummer, huh?
Everyone looks shocked, but Scott acts normal and continues playing with the ball. Even though this is weird, the referee says the game can continue, and Scott scores many points to help his team win the game by a huge margin. His teammates are happy about this, and after the game ends, they head to a restaurant to celebrate. There, Pamela leaves Mick and pushes Boof away so she can sit next to Scott, who has no problem with this. The next day, Scott becomes a huge star, and everyone cheers for him as he arrives at school in his werewolf form. However, Lewis appears to be scared of Scott, and he stays far away from him. Thorne also complains that even though everyone sees Scott as a star, he shouldn't forget that the school has a vice principal who is in control of things. Scott says he's just being cool, and that he's not different from anyone else. During the next game, Scott plays well again and helps his team win by a huge margin.
Go home, son. Go ahead.
However, some of his teammates start feeling bad because he's the only one scoring all the points. The next day, Boof sees Scott as his normal self, and she asks if his fans won't be disappointed that he's not a werewolf today. Scott says it wasn't really his idea to become popular with it, but Boof mentions that there are definitely some advantages to being a werewolf. Scott says there are none, but Pamela suddenly shows up and tells him that Kirk has agreed to let him join the school play. Scott asks if it won't interfere with his time for basketball, but Pamela says it's just a small role for him. Scott looks happy about this, and Boof says she hopes he can admit that there are advantages to being a werewolf. Following this, Scott rehearses his part in the school play as a werewolf, and Kirk looks impressed. After this, Scott spends more time with Pamela, and they head to a bowling alley together. Mick is also there, and he looks pissed when he sees Scott and Pamela together. He eventually eventually confronts Scott and tells him to stay away from Pamela. Scott refuses to do this, and he says that Pamela is his date. Mick then insults Scott and says that he's still just the weirdo he was before he became a werewolf.
Yeah.
He adds that he has dealt with Scott's kind before. Scott looks confused, but Mick jokes that he killed Scott's mom after she tried to steal some chickens in his backyard. Scott seems pissed by this, and he eventually leaves with Pamela. After walking her home, Scott asks if Pamela would like to be his date to the dance, but she says that Mick is still her boyfriend. Scott looks confused, but Pamela implies that hanging out with him doesn't make him her new boyfriend. Scott looks disappointed by this, and he heads home. The following day, Scott helps his team again during their next basketball game, but his teammates aren't happy because they're barely doing anything.
Would you like to walk me home?
Finstock then tells them that the most important thing is to win. After school, Styles repaints Scott's van and calls it the Wolf Mobile. He then suggests going around town with it, and Scott agrees. Scott also asks if Lewis will join them soon, but Styles says he won't. Scott complains that Lewis has been avoiding him, but Styles tells him not to think about it. After this, Styles rides the van, and Scott dances on the roof. He also does a handstand as Styles drives past Harold's store, and Harold sees this. That night, when Scott arrives home, Harold says his son is making a fool of himself with the way he has been acting. Scott says he's just trying to get used to the fact that he's a werewolf, and Harold mentions that he understands. He then asks if Thorn still disturbs Scott. Scott says he does, and Harold mentions that it's because of him. Scott looks confused, but Harold says that many years ago, while he was dating Scott's late mom, Thorn also wanted her and never stopped disturbing her. Harold then had to scare Thorn away in his werewolf form. He adds that Thorn was so terrified that he wet himself.
I don't think I can handle it.
Scott finds this funny, but Harold says that despite what happened, he doesn't know who was most frightened between him and Thorn. He also mentions that Scott has to control himself and watch what he's doing. The next day, while Boof and Scott are walking to school, he asks if she would like to go to the dance with him. Boof says she would, but that she doesn't want him to go as the werewolf. Scott says he'll be average if he doesn't go as the werewolf, and he begs Boof to change her mind. Boof eventually agrees, and later that night, Scott arrives at the dance as a werewolf. Everyone looks excited to see him, and he also dances with Boof. Interestingly, Pamela seems interested in dancing with Scott, and as she ignores Mick, he looks annoyed. He then punches Scott and tells him to stay away from his girl. Scott doesn't understand this because he wasn't even dancing with Pamela, and as he gets pissed, he attacks Mick and rips his shirt. Mick then calls him a monster, and everyone starts wondering if it's safe to be around Scott. Scott looks disappointed, and as he leaves the party, Thorn stops him. Thorn says he has been waiting for Scott to misbehave, and that's what he just did. Scott tries to apologize, but Thorn threatens to expel him. Suddenly, Harold shows up and tells Scott to go home because he wants to speak with Thorn. After Scott leaves, Harold scares Thorn and tells him to stop disturbing his son. Thorn looks terrified and pees himself again, and Harold jokes that some things don't change. The next day, while rehearsing his part for the school play, Scott refuses to change into a werewolf. Kirk says he has to do that, but Scott quits and heads out. He also tells Boof that he's quitting the basketball team. Boof says that even though Scott wants to stop being a werewolf, he doesn't have to quit basketball.
Forget it, Dad. I don't want to talk. Go away.
Scott says he's not a good player when he's just himself, and Styles eventually hears what they're talking about. Styles looks shocked and complains that Scott can't let everyone down because the final of the basketball championship is in 4 hours. Scott insists that he can't be the wolf anymore, and Styles looks disappointed. Shortly after, during the final game against Mick's team, Chubby and his other teammates don't play well. While they're losing, Scott eventually arrives as himself, and Finstock asks about the wolf. Scott says he's not doing that anymore, and even though everyone cheers for him to change into a werewolf, he says he wants to play as himself. Chubby and the others don't think they can win, but Scott encourages them and says it's possible to defeat Mick's team. Following this, the game begins, and Scott encourages his teammates to start shooting more often. Chubby scores a few points in the process, and Scott also helps the team reduce the deficit. Mick tries to provoke Scott by shoving him to the ground, but Scott just smiles and refuses to take the bait. With Scott's team now 1 point behind Mick's team, Mick fouls Scott just as the game is about to end. The referee gives Scott 2 free throws and he stands up to take the shots. After scoring the first one, Mick looks shocked and realizes that Scott is now a better shooter. Scott then scores the winning point and wins the game for his team, leaving Mick disappointed. Everyone celebrates with Scott, and he looks really happy that he played well without becoming the werewolf. As Pamela tries to hug him, he pushes her away and heads toward Boof. Pamela looks disappointed by this, and she watches as Scott celebrates with Boof and Harold.
Hi, Mr. Thorne. How are you, sir?
After Scott realizes that he's a werewolf, he decides to use his unique abilities to become popular and help his struggling basketball team improve. This works out well for him, but his dad eventually warns him to be careful with how he uses his powers. When things nearly get out of control at a school dance, Scott decides to stop using his powers so he won't end up hurting someone. Despite this, Scott helps his team win the basketball championship, and everyone still recognizes him as a star. In this story, we learn that just being yourself is enough, and you don't need special powers to shine.